Greetings, salutations, and words of goodwill. This is the first video in a series I'm doing on early Christian heresies. We won't be covering every last heresy from this time period, but we're going to hit the big ones. However, before I did that, I often find that when it comes to intellectual topics, often people get lost in definitions. They don't necessarily understand what the word they're talking about is before we start talking about it. And so I thought that we would begin by just discussing what a heresy is, what the word means in this context. And in order to do that, we're going to have to define a second word, unfortunately, and maybe even a third, although that's really just more of a basic vocabulary issue. The word comes from the Greek word Heresys, which usually gets translated as sect, implying somehow that a heresy is an organized group of people, and that somehow to be a heretic is to separate yourself from the church organizationally. However, that's a poor translation of the word, because the word really means a philosophical sect, and in that sense refers more to a school of thought than to a group of people. Something slightly greater than an opinion, you might say, which is why the word heresy, as opposed to schism, refers not to something outside in the world, but something that happens internally inside the person, specifically inside of their mind. The most formal definition of heresy from the contemporary era comes from Roman Catholic canon law, where it says heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, which is just a very fancy legal way of saying that it's when someone who's Christian denies a dogma of the faith. Now, what's a dogma? A dogma is a type of doctrine, which is a teaching of a church body. Specifically, it is a doctrine which is created by something called a definitive act, namely an act which defines the beliefs of the organization. It sets the boundary of the beliefs in the organization such that no one inside of that community is permitted to believe anything else. And specifically, it sets the boundaries regarding what has been revealed by God, which Catholics and many other Christians often call the deposit of faith, what God has given to us to keep safe. So in that sense, it also defines what is contained in that deposit. And then finally, usually dogmas are understood to be so definitive that there's no going back on them, and that therefore they must be true, they must be actually revealed by God, and in that sense they're infallible. So a complete definition of dogma, within the context of at least Catholic theology, is an infallible doctrine proclaimed as part of the deposit by a definitive act. And so in order to commit heresy in the contemporary church, or at least in the way the word is used formally, one has to be baptized, and then one has to deny one of these dogmas. And while the dogmas are infallible and can't be wrong, they do change in the sense that over time we get more of them because you get more of these definitive acts. And so something which is heresy right now may not have been heresy 500, 1,000, 1,500 years ago. However, there's a much more informal definition of heresy, and I would actually argue that it must be one of the earlier definitions of heresy, because people get called heretics really before we have almost any of these definitive acts, and surely not definitive acts regarding the topics that people are being called heretics about. And so heresy is also often used simply to mean a belief or opinion which is contrary to that deposit itself, which is contrary to the revelation of God. And that's really the way that the word heresy is being used in this particular time period that we're talking about. So when I call these things early church heresies, most, if not all of them, have been condemned by the church by a definitive dogmatic act. But in the time period that we're talking about, they usually hadn't been, or the manner in which they had been was not obviously so to the individuals who believed them. So you have to keep that in mind. In essence, what we're talking about here then is beliefs that Christians held that are the opposite of what Jesus revealed to humanity, or God the Father in the Old Testament, etc., etc. And of course, the reason for the connection between these two, in case it's not obvious, is that the dogma is meant to guarantee or to clarify the revelation that is given by God. And so what one knows from, or what one is expected to believe in certain Christian groups from the dogma, is that the doctrine in question is indeed part of the deposit. And so what the dogma does is create a juridical or epistemic tool to demonstrate that someone has indeed violated the deposit. In that sense, then, is a heretic in the second sense. And so the meaning of the word heretic gradually shrinks to mean not someone who's violating the deposit more broadly, but rather is violating it in a way which is marked out by this specific tool. Since we're covering heresy, though, there's one other topic that we might as well bring up or mention, and that's the difference between formal heresy and material heresy. And basically, formal heresy is when you do this knowing you're doing it. So you know what the truth is, or you know what the dogma is, and you willfully and knowingly reject that dogma. Whereas material heresy is when you're just, oops, I'm mistaken. Technically, you do hold an opinion contrary to one of these two things, but it's not really your fault. You just were trying to figure out what the truth is, and you made a mistake. And Catholics, at the very least, believe that's possible. Most Christians do, although there's some who will always sort of imply that if you don't believe the dogma, it must be because you don't want to. And so that's what we got today. In the next video, I'll be going into Judaizers, which is the very earliest of heresies that we see in the book of Acts. So please remember to like and subscribe and comment and do whatever else you do. And until next time, God bless and have a great day.